up here? Great, got it. Suzanne, you want to join us up here as well? I know you're.
Okay.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Sit down.
Oh, I'm going to mention that you're here. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to talk about human trafficking and the work Nebraska has done. Human trafficking is a modern form of slavery. It is despicable and is something that shows a sickening disregard for human dignity. And it's also something the state of Nebraska has been working hard to fight, especially under the leadership of our Attorney General, Doug Peterson. And you see this manifested in a variety of different ways that the state of Nebraska has been working to combat human trafficking. First of all, one of the things that we need to all remember is that, and of course I'm being joined here by Colonel Bulldog, obviously from the Nebraska State Patrol, and our Attorney General, Doug Peterson, as well as my lovely wife, Suzanne Shore, our First Lady, who has also been supportive of the work we're doing here with regard to human trafficking. One of the things that I think a lot of people maybe think is that, well, human trafficking is something that happens someplace else. And that is simply not true. It's something that is all across the state of Nebraska, and why it's so important that every citizen is aware of what to look for to be able to help combat it. It's one of the key things we've done is try to help educate people that when you are traveling down Interstate 80, for example, and maybe going to a rest stop, or at casinos, or hotels, or gas stations, every Nebraskan can be involved in the fight to combat human trafficking by being aware of the signs of what it may be. It could be somebody who doesn't have control of their credit card, or their driver's license, or their cell phone. And that's part of what we do at the state of Nebraska, is help educate people about those signs so that we can be aware. The Department of Health and Human Services worked to train about 1,800 people of our own state teammates and other professionals about the warning signs. The Attorney General has his Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force, which he set up in 2015 to be able to help educate county attorneys, police recruits, schools about those signs. We work with the Nebraska Hospital Association to train emergency room doctors, for example, of those signs. And in fact, we had a case where a doctor who had just been trained and was alert was able to spot a supposed boyfriend and his girlfriend that came in, and was able to call law enforcement to be able to help rescue that woman from human trafficking. So being aware absolutely works. In fact, there's a national hotline out there, which is 888-373-7888. So 888-373-7888 to be able to call in if you suspect somebody is being trafficked. And the Department of Transportation puts up informational signs on our rest stops across the state to be able to help flag that. So it's an important way that, again, another way the state helps try to educate people with regard to how do we combat human trafficking. So that's one of the ways that we do it. In the Nebraska legislature, they've also worked to be able to pass legislation. And this is important because while there are federal laws against human trafficking, if that human trafficking does not cross state lines, then that is a state offense. So it's important to have strong laws on the books here to be able to prosecute human traffickers. And the legislature has done that. For example, Julie Salam in 2019 passed LB 519, which, for example, took the statute of limitations off trafficking minors. Last year, Senator Pansing Brooks passed LB 461 to add casinos to the list of organizations that had to provide information and make sure that their patrons were aware of human trafficking and so forth. So that's one of the ways. And then, of course, not only raising awareness and passing legislation and having stiff penalties for human traffickers is important, but also then the prosecution. So, for example, last year on August 26th and 27th, the state of Nebraska participated in Operation United Front, which was an operation across 12 different states to be able to combat human trafficking. And it was from Scottsbluff to Kearney to South Sioux City. It resulted in 7 arrests here in the state of Nebraska as part of that overall operation. And then just last year as well, the Attorney General prosecuted 22 cases, including actually helping breaking up a case in Furnace County where the lead perpetrator, I just believe, got 176 years in prison on 13 felony counts, including prosecuting a minor, or trafficking a minor. So again, the law enforcement aspect is also important, and that's of course why we have the Attorney General, Colonel Bullock, here. And then finally, of course, when the prosecution of these cases closes and we get a conviction, that's not the end, right? You still have the victims, the survivors who need care. And that's where you have a number of organizations across the state who work to be able to help those victims. I see Julie Schrader's here in the front row with Rejuvenating Women to be able to help with that. In fact, the state of Nebraska in 2020 got a 3-year, $1.5 million grant from the federal government to be able to work with organizations specifically around children and minors who experience trafficking, to be able to help those survivors. We work with the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation to be able to, as the person who's helping us with that grant, to be able to provide that support for those folks who have been victims of trafficking. So this really is something where we at the state have to take a long-term broad view about all the aspects of human trafficking to be able to end this scourge of our society. So today we're here to help raise awareness for human trafficking, and I'm going to have the Attorney General and the Colonel talk about that a little bit more. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and sign this proclamation declaring January as Human Trafficking Awareness Month in Nebraska, so that we can have, again, get citizens to take due note of it, of the observance, and educate themselves on what they can do to be able to help prevent human trafficking here in the state of Nebraska. So we are officially proclaimed. And with that, now I will turn it over to our Attorney General, who will say a few words.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for the familiar faces I see in this room. 2021 was an important year in the efforts of human trafficking, because really we continue to advance what needs to be done in the area of protecting particularly youth and others who be trafficked, whether by sex trafficking or labor trafficking. What was so important about 2021 is the number of prosecutions, but particularly Furnace County, because what that represented was, to me, an important exhibit of how human trafficking can occur in the smallest communities and in the most heinous ways. That situation in Furnace County really is a great case study of how trafficking can occur in some of the smallest communities. It was Oxford, Nebraska, a very small community, and a person who really felt he was above the law and that he could traffic a 15-year-old girl around the community, around the county in that area, and not have any repercussions for it. I appreciate, because the whole process came together in the way we were hoping it would come together. You had a citizen report it to law enforcement. Something's not right. Law enforcement contacts our investigators, and we start digging into it deeply. Thank you to Anna Brewer and all the hard work she did out in Furnace County working this investigation. It allowed us to network with both local law enforcement, but our great partner, the Nebraska State Patrol and Colonel Bullock, has been one of the strongest assets in our ability to go forward with investigation and prosecution. We found out that there was a fairly broad network of consumers who were engaged in the trafficking of this young lady. We were able to get convictions not only on the trafficker, but many of the customers. And so that's the way the plan was designed. This would have been a case that 8 years ago, I'm not sure it would be nearly as strong a prosecution that we had here. And also had great cooperation from the county attorney in Furnace County and their law enforcement agency. So I have to say, for all the work, and some of the people in this room who worked so hard on that case and worked so hard over the years, 8 years, 9 years of working in the area of human trafficking to get Nebraska where it needed to be. 2021 was an example that it's not like we're ever in a position to say we've arrived, but we got accomplished in 2021 what we wanted to get accomplished with this law. And I think going forward, we're excited about the partnerships that we can do going forward, expanding stronger relationships. One of the challenges will always be in making sure the victims are properly served afterwards, as the governor mentioned. There's a lot of people who have a heart in Nebraska to do that, but it's not easy. A human trafficking victim takes a lot of time to get them back to a state of mind that they basically understand the importance of their own human dignity. It's not a 6-month program. It's much more involved than that, and it takes specialized training. And that's where those are some of the next steps that we need to continue to develop. But I want to thank everyone who's been involved, not just for the success in the case in Furnace County, but for the efforts and the commitment to this going back 10 years ago, frankly, to get us where we are today, and who have the enthusiasm and desire to take us even further where we need to go with human trafficking in Nebraska. So thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to Colonel Bolduc.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Attorney General. There are many phases to our state's fight against human trafficking. As the Attorney General mentioned, prosecution in high-profile cases have occurred recently, and thankfully those who have committed these horrible crimes are being held accountable for that. But there's a tremendous amount of work that leads up to a conviction, and there's great teamwork that's required to bring these cases to fruition. Our investigators are well trained to look beyond the initial information that's available, and that's thanks to training opportunities made possible through the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force. And there's other organizations that we partner with that bring this type of training to our frontline investigators and police officers across the state. One of the groups that we work with in partnership is Truckers Against Trafficking and the Commercial Vehicle Safety Administration, or CVSA. Those partnerships help train troopers and investigators who then share that training with local law enforcement officers and other officials throughout Nebraska and even beyond our borders. Truckers Against Trafficking is also heavily involved in raising awareness about human trafficking, particularly in their industry. They share information about spotting the signs of human trafficking with truck drivers and others who work in that industry, and that's across the country. In many cases, the first indicator in human trafficking cases comes from someone who has been made aware of the signs and tips off law enforcement to what they have observed. Knowing the signs can make a difference in rescuing human trafficking victims, which can then lead to these investigations and ultimately successful prosecutions and rehabilitation for the victim. As we've seen with the prosecution that the Attorney General mentioned this morning, as well as some of the other sex and labor trafficking cases, they're not limited to just big cities. They really happen across the country in rural America too. So we're not exempt from that. They can occur anywhere. So please, if you see something that doesn't look right, if you see one of the signs of human trafficking, please report it immediately to local law enforcement. Call 911. That phone call can be all the difference to that victim in rescuing them out of that situation. Thank you, and I'd like to turn it over to the Governor for questions at this time.
Great, thank you very much, Colonel. And again, just emphasize the opportunity there for people to be able to learn the signs. Some of the ones I mentioned earlier at the top of this press conference with regard to something just doesn't seem right, people who don't have control of their IDs or their credit cards or their phones, things like that. And either, as the Colonel said, call 911 to tip off law enforcement. You can call that trafficking net hotline, that 888-373-7888, to be able to make sure that somebody is aware of what's going on here so that we can do it. And as I mentioned, DHHS has trained about 1,800 people. I know the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force has trained about 6,800 people, including law enforcement officers, again, county attorneys, school officials, and so forth, to be able to help raise awareness for this. And then finally, just I would say one thing, just shame on the consumers here. Shame on those men who are trafficking. Again, when you hear about a 15-year-old girl, that is just despicable. It's just unbelievable. So it does require all of us to be a part of this fight to end human trafficking here in Nebraska. And so with that, I'll go ahead and open up to questions and answers for myself or any of the folks up here. We'll keep the topics to human trafficking until we run out of those. If we have time left, we'll open up to other topics. Questions on human trafficking? Martha, go ahead.
For Attorney General Peterson, you mentioned that some of the next steps have to do with helping the victims of human trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that some more? Where are we on that?
Yes, brother. First, I forgot to mention our Human Trafficking Task Force coordinator, Glenn Parks, and thank Glenn for. Glenn is the one in, day out, is making sure that we're looking from the front end of human trafficking to the back ends with regards to relationships across the state. So Glenn, thank you for your work. And as to that question, Martha, there are so many people, when we go around the state and try to speak about human trafficking and awareness, there's so many people who come up and say, how can I get involved? How can I be engaged? One of the things I would like to see us do, and when I talked about challenges going forward, is I would like to see the state of Nebraska develop. There's certainly, for example, the work that Julie does in their facility. They're working with these women to make sure that they're getting the appropriate psychological counseling, but also some basic life counseling going forward, what their future looks like as far as employment and things of that nature. Another area where I think Nebraska could really step up its game is in the area of foster care. Where do we stand with regards? We have families who are willing to do foster care, but if people have on their heart a real burden for human trafficking victims, or both sex and labor trafficking, but sex trafficking victims, one of the things that I think Nebraska could do is better develop training for those people who want to step forward as foster parents, specifically for young ladies and young boys that have been pulled out of human trafficking rings. And so I know Florida has a good program in that regard, and so I think we want to be looking at where we can model some successful foster care, especially designated human trafficking homes, so that we can best, it's a much different scenario when you're taking a child who's been trafficked for a year to provide those foster parent services. So those are just a couple of areas where I'd like to expand. There are a lot of people who their hearts are so compelled in this area that they want to build a home and dedicate a home and say, hey, we're going to create a human trafficking survivor home. But the problem is it's a little bit more difficult than that. It's not simply building a home and putting together some bedrooms to provide care. There's a lot more that goes into that. And I think the work that Julie has done in their facility is a good example of that. The need is there. The demand is there for those facilities. Andrew.
Doug, how has the shift gone from prosecuting the women or the people to other people, the consumer and the trafficker, and how has that helped in your investigation?
Well, it's helped a lot because the buying.
Read the question.
Yeah. The question was, how has it changed with regards to the perspective of, you used to arrest a 16-year-old found in a hotel room or a 17-year-old as a prostitute, to now where we understand that they're most likely a part of a human trafficking sex ring. And how's that transition gone? You know, the most important group, Andrew, in that particular transition was law enforcement, because law enforcement is in there day in, day out, and you can kind of become callous to patterns of lawlessness. And the law enforcement community has been excellent in stepping up, and as I said, the State Patrol has been an excellent partner in this. They bought in 100%. So I didn't have concerns about the Nebraska State Patrol, and Omaha had been prosecuting human trafficking cases. There were some in Lincoln. But as you looked at greater Nebraska, could they understand what we're looking at, different police departments and sheriff's departments? And they have. Furnace County is a great example of that. The Furnace County law enforcement, they first of all identified, hey, we will take the support of the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force. So now you get a former FBI agent who specialized in human trafficking coming, working side by side with the Furnace County Sheriff's Department and doing investigations. And so I think the most important thing in this whole process is law enforcement now identifies it, recognizes that the 16-year-old is a victim, not a businesswoman subject to criminal charges. That paradigm, they're two very separate ones. So now they understand the human trafficking element, the business model, and then they also understand that we can work together and utilize our investigative talents in our office to get the conviction.
And Governor, what more can be done to prevent, you guys are doing a lot on enforcement and trying to catch human trafficking. What can be done more to prevent human trafficking? I know that you stepped up some of the bridge programs and the foster care.
Yeah, I think that what we gotta remember is that this is something that we need to continually be fighting with regard to human trafficking. So all the efforts that I outlined are things that we need to continue to focus on. So whether it's raising more awareness among the public so they can help spot those warning signs, to making sure we're continuing to look at what additional legislation do we need to pass to strengthen our laws against human trafficking, and then the enforcement side that the Attorney General was just talking about. And then finally, one of the things is the Attorney General was also pointing out with regard to, can we do more with regard to foster care? Can we do more with regard to supporting these young people before they get involved in human trafficking? There are opportunities there because there's a number of different groups across the state that are child advocacy groups that we can be involved with to be able to help them to try and prevent this from happening in the first place. So I think it's gonna be one of those things where we're gonna have to continually look for how we can improve our responses so we can do a better job in stamping out this really scourge on our society. And I don't know, I'm gonna ask my first wife, the First Lady, to see if there's anything else that she would like to add to that with regard to what can we do to be preventative or to help survivors.
So I played nothing but a supportive role in all of this, and I admire everyone who's done so much work. It's amazing. Just like every other problem, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there is so much that needs to be done up front when it comes to issues such as self-esteem for these women who are pulled in, men who are pulled in, grooming. Legislation can occur. And then during the process, thank you so much, Attorney General, for everything you've done. You've really transformed this issue for our state. And then last of all are the services. And this is such a complex situation for these poor victims who have gone through so much. It's complicated, it's expensive, but thank goodness there are people out there who are willing to provide those services. And we just need to give them support and expand those services across the state, because it's not just Omaha who needs these, not just Lincoln, it's throughout Nebraska.
Thank you. Martha.
So a lot of your discussion today has been focused on sex trafficking. What do we see in terms of labor trafficking in the state?
So Martha's question was, we've talked a lot about sex trafficking, but what about labor trafficking? And so Attorney General, I'm going to ask you to comment on that.
You know, I've mentioned the Fergus County case. When I sit back here, then I remember all the things I should have said. But there was also a very important prosecution in Hall County this year, and the Hall County Attorney's Office did an excellent job there, and really give them kudos for the hard work they did in that prosecution. They still have one case they have to go to trial with, but they've been successful in the Hall County case also. With regard, that's a good question, Martha, because labor trafficking often has an international flair to it, and therefore we're a little bit more deferential to Homeland Security and the work that they do in that regard. But we still have a role to play working with them. The other area that I think is really an area that is a combination of both sex and labor trafficking, but and it certainly has an international flair, and we are going to continue to work. I got to say, we have great partners from the law enforcement standpoint, but we also have great partners from the federal side. And one of the areas in labor trafficking that is, as I said, both a labor and sex, is in the area of massage parlors. And there's an international, national network of what's going on, and again, Nebraska is not unusual. It has the issues here that we have to be responding to. But in that regard, that a lot of that is a labor trafficking, because some of those can be women from China who are 35 years old, and it doesn't fit the natural, maybe some of the sex trafficking elements, but it sure looks like labor trafficking as to the conditions that they have to work under. So the labor trafficking one is that I think primarily led by the feds, but we also think it's a very important issue that we can do our own work in. Frankly, when the cases come in, though, they typically come in from a federal side rather than someone coming forward, but we'll certainly be interested in taking any of that type of information.
All right, other questions on this topic? All right, seeing none, I'll go ahead and Thank the Attorney General for all the great work you've done since you got elected in 2015, or got elected 2014, but since you took office 2015, for all the great work with the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force, and the great work I think I saw we've done over the course of the last, course of your time as AG, we've had 76 prosecutions of sex trafficking. So great job on that, and then I want to thank the Colonel for all the great work the Nebraska State Patrol has done and continues to do on this topic and other topics as you work to keep the citizens of Nebraska safe. And always I'll say thank you to my lovely wife, Suzanne. So, great. All right, so, and you all can stay up here while I answer the questions, or you can step to the side. It's your preference. All right, so we'll take other questions. Oh, sure. Can you come back real quick, Attorney General? Fred's got a question for you.
The buzzer went off.
Yes, Fred.
Your office is going to court next week to oppose the Omaha math mandate. Can you summarize the argument?
Yeah. As you know, back in the...
Why don't you repeat the question again, too, please?
You always have a reminder. The question from the distinguished Fred Knapp was basically an update on what's going on with the mandate in Omaha. We have a hearing, as you know, next Tuesday. Our position is fairly straightforward. The Nebraska statutes were developed long before COVID as to the process of dealing with this type of medical emergency. It had a provision that cities and counties of the population similar to Omaha and Lincoln could create their own city-county health group to address these issues without getting the approval of HHS. Lincoln, Lancaster County did that. That's why you see them being able, through their health director, to be able to issue the mandates. Omaha never did. So Omaha understood that their other option was to have their city council vote on passing a mask mandate, and they did that. They let the mask mandate expire. The new health director, county health director, attempted to submit on behalf of the city of Omaha another mask mandate. Through the proper process, she submitted it to the medical director for the state of Nebraska. It was denied. And it's at that point that things changed. Because somehow someone gave them counsel that with their city ordinances they had the ability not to do the process through the city council, but somehow create a fictitious city health director. And when they did that, that's acting outside the scope of the statutory structure. And they understand it because they worked within the scope and now they're outside the scope. They tried to come out and cite ordinances, which are preempted by the Nebraska statute. So in some ways, they completely understand what they're doing here. And it takes away from the democratic process that the city council is the one with the authority. That's where the accountability lies for the citizens of Omaha. I want to be really clear. This is not a legal battle on mandates, mask mandates. Are they good or are they bad? That's not the question. As the Attorney General, that's not my role to make that determination. But my role is important in the fact that I have to make sure that they don't abuse their authority or misuse their authority outside the scope of our statutory guidelines. They got outside the rails by trying to do that, and so we'll submit that to the judge.
And when did Lincoln do its creation of, was that 1800 or something?
No, when did Lincoln do that? I want to say 1997. I don't have my people in here, but they did it fairly soon after Senator Landis was the one who put forward the provision for them to do it. Lincoln did it. So I imagine in the community there's some confusion. I don't understand this. The health director in Lincoln can come forward and do mask mandates. Why can't Omaha? Because they never exercised that process that was set forth in the legislature in the statutory language. And that's why they had to do it as a mandate through the city council. And frankly, if they want to do a mandate, it has to go back and be done by the city council in Omaha. Andrew.
Judge, it could take a while before a decision is made by the court. I mean, that Omaha mask mandate may already expire by then.
Yeah, I would admit that's a frustrating process. The case was assigned, when we filed the case, seeking injunctive relief, seeking a hearing. Initially, the hearing date was given to us as Tuesday of this week, today. The district court judge who was assigned the case asked that it be pushed back to next week. That was a little difficult for us to accept because, in my mind, each day that mandate's in effect, it's in effect on the citizens of Omaha without the authority to do so. But understanding the court's calendar and the judge's calendar, I had to be deferential to that, and so we're going to do it next week.
All right, thank you, Attorney General, appreciate that. And just, I'll comment that I think that when public health officials act outside the law, it undermines the faith in all of our public health structure here. So this is really discrediting what public health officials do by acting outside the scope of the law. Other questions? Martha?
Governor, can you comment on Nebraska Medical Center's decision to implement the crisis standards of care in response to the growing number of COVID cases that they're seeing?
Yeah, so Martha asks, can I comment on Nebraska Medicine's crisis standards of care announcement with regard to the growing number of hospitalizations that they have? And I think it reflects that Nebraska Medicine has staffing challenges, and that's why they issued the crisis standards of care. And that's the purpose of our directed health measure, is to address those issues as well specifically so that they can make sure they've got the staff available to, you know, obviously we're banning elective procedures so that they can have the staff available to be able to take care of the patients they have in the hospital. Right now, I saw the number today. I think we're in somewhere 660. Is that right, Alex? How many patients in the hospital? 660 statewide. And I didn't look. The last numbers I saw showed that the ICU capacity in Omaha had actually gotten better. I think it reached a high of 93% and was down to 86 or 89%. It was the last report I got, and in Lincoln it was down to 82%. So hopefully that that ICU capacity can, you know, maintain at a level where patients can be accommodated.
643.
Sorry, what is it?
643.
643. Thank you very much.
But is Nebraska Medical Center not able to control the number of elective surgeries that they handle on their own without you doing the DHM?
So with regard, the question was, can't Nebraska Medicine manage this on their own? And of course, they had been managing it, but then of course that also led to them declaring the crisis standard of care, which is why we felt it was important for the state to step in and make sure we had a directed health measure. Paul?
What difference did your DHM make? Weren't they already limiting their surgeries?
So with regard, Paul's asking what difference does the DHM make? And again, this is, you know, putting into really law that they have to be able to make sure that they're taking care of their patients by banning elective surgeries. And we're basically just trying to help them out to make sure that they can manage their staffing issues.
And I noticed you're not wearing a mask today. Did you ever test positive, or you just passed the period of time that you needed to wear a mask?
So Paul's asking with regard to, I'm not wearing a mask today, yes. So I'm following the CDC guidelines with regard to after you've been exposed, 10 days later you can take the mask off, and so I'm past my 10-day mark.
Did you ever test positive?
And I never tested, so, because I never had any symptoms.
Andrew?
I'm sorry, Andrew.
Oh,
Wasn't trying to ignore you.
no, okay. You said before that you're working on something to help maybe, you know, open up some skilled nursing beds and maybe alleviate some of the, you know, the problems that hospitals are having. What are you working on?
So with regard to some of our attempts to maybe alleviate some of this pressure, I don't have an announcement for you right now, Andrew. We're still working through those plans. Yeah.
Governor, we've heard some reports in Central Nebraska that having access to COVID testing is getting extremely difficult. The Loop Basin in particular has been sending folks to Great Island, and Great Island does not have any testing available. Are there any plans to expand testing across the state to make that more available in some of the rural areas?
So with regard to testing and expanding testing, especially in rural areas, it is one of the things that we're working on that as well to see what we can do from the state standpoint. However, I will again point out that counties have their own ARPA money, and they've had it for close to a year now. So they have their own resources to be able to help expand that testing as well.
One more question, if anybody wants it.
Last question. Paul?
You flying around with Jim Pillen today to promote his candidacy for governor?
So Paul's asking me if I'm going to be flying around with Jim Pillen today. I would say just stay tuned. I think there's going to be another press briefing at 10 a.m. All right, folks, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Everybody have a great rest of your week.